The bidding had already reached $40 when the barn door swung open and let in a blade of cold air that cut straight through to the bone. Josephine didn't look up. She had stopped looking at faces an hour ago. When the first man leaned over the fence rail and called out a price like she was a good milk cow, she kept her eyes on the mud caking the hem of her dress and on the small weight of her daughter pressed against her chest. Lily, 14 months old, too cold to cry anymore, just breathing in shallow little pulls against Josephine's collarbone. The auctioneer, a man named Potts with a red silk handkerchief he kept dabbing at his forehead despite the January freeze, cleared his throat and called out 42. Someone toward the back raised it to 45. Josephine thought of her husband, Emmett. How he would have stood between her and this. How he had promised her once, in the good years, that no harm would come to them as long as he drew breath. He had stopped drawing breath 6 weeks ago. Fever, the doctor said. Nothing to be done. And without him, without the deed to the land he'd never finished paying, without a single relative within 400 miles, she had come down from the ridge with her baby and her last $2 and walked straight into a town that had already decided what to do with her. $48. The bidding slowed the way it always did just before something was settled. Josephine could feel Potts looking at her, checking she was still standing upright, still presentable. She was. She had made sure of that. She had combed her hair by feel in the dark that morning, pinned it back with the one pin she hadn't lost, and kept Lily's face clean even when her own hands were cracked and bleeding from the cold. If she was going to stand here, she was going to stand here with some dignity, even if no one in this town seemed to think she deserved any. $50. Nobody raised it. The crowd shifted. A man near the front spat into the dirt, and then, from somewhere near the back, a voice came through. 60. The word landed flat and certain, the way a stone lands when you drop it into still water. Not loud, not boastful, just there, and impossible to ignore. Josephine looked up for the first time. The man, standing at the back of the crowd, was the kind of man you noticed before you understood why. He was large, the kind of large that came from a life of actual labor rather than any particular intention. He had the look of someone who spent most of his time somewhere that wasn't near other people. Weathered skin, dark coat, a hat pulled low over eyes that were moving steadily across the scene in front of him with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite anything else. He was late. He had clearly ridden fast to get here. His horse was still heaving outside. The mud on his boots went up past the ankles. Potts recovered himself and called back. 65? The crowd looked toward the newcomer. The newcomer said nothing. He reached into his coat, pulled out a leather pouch, and held it up. What's in it? Covers the debt. Keep the rest. Potts opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. The man walked forward through the crowd, the way water moves through grass. Not shoving, not stopping, just moving. And people stepped back from him without quite knowing they were doing it. He stopped in front of the auctioneer's platform, set the pouch down on the rail, and then he looked at Josephine for the first time. Not the way the other men had looked at her. Not like something to be assessed or managed or endured. He looked at her like she was a person. "You want out of this?" he said. She didn't know him. She had never seen him in her life. He could have been anyone. She said yes. His name was Callum. That was all she got for the first 3 miles, riding behind him on a horse so large her feet didn't come close to clearing the stirrups, even when she tried. Lily was tucked inside Josephine's coat, her small back rising and falling in shallow, exhausted sleep. The cold was extraordinary. The kind of cold that got into the spaces behind your teeth. Callum didn't speak. He rode with the easy certainty of someone who had been doing it so long it was no longer a thing he needed to think about. Josephine watched the back of his shoulders and tried to put together any kind of story that explained what had just happened. A good man, maybe. A man with money to spare and a generous impulse. A man who had known Emmett. a man who had known her father, a man who owed someone a favor. She was tired of trying to figure out what men wanted from her. She was cold, and Lily was cold. It was better than what it had been. And the cabin came into view, around a bend in the ridgeline, as the light started to flatten toward afternoon grey. It was not what she expected. It was not what she feared. It was solid, notched logs, a good tight roof, smoke coming from a stone chimney that someone had built to last. There was a lean-to on the east side with 2 more horses and a mule inside, and a small yard that was currently occupied by a large, unimpressed goat who watched them arrive with the particular skepticism of animals that have survived multiple winters. Callum dismounted and took the horse's reins without comment. "Wood's inside," he said. "Fire's down, but not out. There's food in the crate on the left. Where will you? Horses need seeing to." He walked toward the lean-to. Josephine stood in the yard for a moment with Lily on her chest, and the goat staring at her and the cabin waiting, and she made the only decision available to her. She went inside. The fire was not down. It was mostly out, which was different. Josephine had grown up in a house where the fire was her mother's responsibility, and she had understood by the age of 7 that a fire allowed to go mostly out was a domestic failure that no one would explicitly acknowledge and no one would forget. She found the iron poker, found the coals, found a few sticks of fatwood in the box beside the hearth, and within 10 minutes she had something burning again. She unwrapped Lily and held her close to the warmth and watched her daughter's face slowly come back to itself. Cheeks pinking, the tight anxious set of her features loosening into something that was almost peace. "Hey," Josephine murmured. "Hey, there you are." Lily blinked at her with those serious grey eyes she'd gotten from Emmett and reached up and grabbed Josephine's nose, which she had been doing since she learned she could. "That's mine," Josephine told her. Lily held on. Josephine laughed for the first time in 6 weeks. Callum came inside as the light died. He stamped the snow from his boots at the door. Emmett had never done that, and it had been a minor eternal frustration, and shrugged out of his coat and hung it on the peg beside the door. Under the coat he was wearing a wool flannel shirt, dark blue, with a tear that had been mended clumsily at the left shoulder. He looked at the fire, which was burning properly now, and then he looked at the pot she had found and filled with the dried beans and salt pork from the crate, which was currently doing something promising on the hook. He didn't say anything. She waited. He sat down at the table, and she served the beans because she had made them, and it seemed reasonable, and they ate in a silence that was not comfortable exactly, but was not hostile either. Lily sat on Josephine's knee and ate soft bits of salt pork and examined Callum with the frank curiosity of a child who has not yet learned that staring is considered rude. Callum looked back at her. "She hungry?" he said. She was. "She's better." He nodded once and went back to eating. After the meal, Josephine said, "Why did you do it?" He considered this for a longer time than she expected. "You needed doing for," he said at last. "That's not really an answer." He looked at her steadily. He had very pale eyes, she noticed, not unkind eyes. "It's the one I've got," he said. She kept them, for now. 3 days passed, then a week. The shape of life in the cabin arranged itself slowly, the way furniture arranges itself in a room you're going to live in. Not all at once, not with any plan, just piece by piece, until one morning you look up and notice it's where everything belongs. Callum was gone before full light, checking traps on the ridge. He came back by mid-morning. He split wood in the afternoon. He did not talk much, but he was not silent in the way that meant something bad. He was silent, the way some places are silent, full rather than empty, the kind of quiet that didn't need filling. Sometimes in the evenings he would sharpen a tool or work on a piece of harness leather at the table, and Josephine would sit near the fire with Lily. And the sound of that work, the rhythmic drag of the whetstone, the soft pop of the fire, was one of the most peaceful things she could remember hearing. She was not foolish. She knew what people in town would say. She knew the situation had the shape of something that could be misread or taken advantage of. She watched for signs of it the same way she watched for ice, on the path to the well, carefully and without being obvious about it. There were no signs of it. What there was this. On the 4th day, she came down with a fever, nothing serious, the kind that lasts 3 days, and feels like dying and then breaks, and you feel ashamed of all the drama. But on the 2nd day, when it was worst, she woke from a confused and terrible sleep to find that Lily was not in the blankets beside her. She sat up in a panic that was immediate and total. Lily was at the table, seated in Callum's lap, carefully, and with great seriousness examining a carved wooden figure of a horse that Callum appeared to have given her. Callum was watching her do this with an expression on his face that Josephine had not seen on him before. He looked, she thought, almost at ease. He looked up and saw Josephine watching. "She was up," he said. "Didn't want to wake you." Josephine lay back down. She did not trust herself to say anything. The trouble came on a Thursday in February. She had heard the name Dana before. From Emmett, once, before he got sick, in the way men mention names they don't want to say twice. A landman. A man who collected debts and expanded acreage, and was not overly particular about how either of those things happened. She didn't know he had a claim on Emmett's land. She didn't know about the second note the one signed in a bad season that Emmett had never told her about because he was too proud, and too scared, and too sure he would find another way. 2 men rode up on Thursday afternoon when Callum was on the ridge. She saw them from the window and felt the familiar drop in her stomach. They said they were there on behalf of Dana. They said the land note was due, that Emmett had signed it, that it transferred to her at his death. They said the amount with the interest that had accrued since November. It was an amount she could not pay. They told her she had a week. She stood in the doorway and watched them ride back down the ridge and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, "I will not go back to that yard in town. I will not stand there again. Whatever happens, I will not do that again." She did not tell Callum when he came in. She told him at dinner instead, because keeping it was worse than saying it, which was as interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How much?" she told him. He pushed back from the table and went to the corner and lifted the board she hadn't known was loose and came back with a tin box. He didn't open it in front of her. He just set it on the table. "It'll cover it," he said. She stared at him. "Callum, I can't. You didn't ask," he said. "I'm offering, that's your—" "It's money," he said. "It'll grow back. A woman and her girl won't." She couldn't find any words. He picked up the tin and put it back in the corner and went and stood at the window looking out at the dark ridge. "They'll come back anyway," he said. It was not a question. "Men like Dana usually do." He nodded slowly. "Then we'll need to be ready." She did not ask what he meant by we. They came back in force, as men like Dana always did when they thought they had leverage. 4 riders, and an air of bureaucratic menace that Josephine recognized from that day at the auction barn. They came on a morning when the sky had turned the particular still white that meant snow behind it. Callum was at the cabin. He came outside when he heard them, no weapon visible, just his height, and the way he carried himself, which was a kind of weapon on its own. The man in front was Dana himself, she realized. Medium height, heavy through the chest, wearing the kind of suit that said he wanted to be taken for a city man, even out here. He looked at Callum the way men like Dana always look at men like Callum, with the specific displeasure of someone who has found an obstacle he didn't plan for. "Mrs. Aldert's a widow," Dana said. "She's got a note that's come due. I'm here to collect or foreclose." "Debt's cleared," Callum said. Dana blinked. "Cleared? Paid to your man 2 days ago. I've got the receipt." There was a pause. Dana looked past Callum toward the cabin. His eyes moved to Josephine in the doorway, then to Lily on her hip, then back to Callum. Something shifted in his expression, the calculation of a man deciding whether to cut his losses or press his luck. He pressed his luck. There's also the matter of the property itself, Dana said. I've got a buyer who, land's not for sale. That's not your call to make. Callum said nothing. One of Dana's riders shifted in the saddle and let his coat fall back to show the pistol at his hip. It was a practiced move, the kind you rehearse, designed to make a certain point without quite being a direct threat. Callum looked at the pistol, then at the rider, then back at Dana. You want to do this, he said. We'll do this. But I'd think about what that looks like afterward. Man like you, in a town this size, pressing a widow off her dead husband's land. What that story sounds like when it gets told. The snow started then, small and quiet, just beginning. Dana sat on his horse in the new silence. The riders looked at each other. The calculation was visible on his face, the arithmetic of risk and reputation, and Josephine watched it resolve itself. Dana straightened his jacket. I'll need to verify the receipt, he said. Come back with a lawyer, Callum said. The receipt'll still be there. They left. That night, after Lily was downed, Josephine sat at the table and tried to think of how to say thank you for something that didn't have a name yet, something that had started as rescue and become, in the weeks since, something more like. She didn't have the word. Not safety exactly, though it was that, something more specific than safety. Callum came in from his last check of the animals and hung up his coat. He looked at her, sitting at the table, and did not ask what she was thinking about, which was one of the things she had come to understand about him. He didn't ask. He waited. My mother used to say. Josephine started and stopped. He sat down across from her. She used to say that the people who save you aren't always the people you expected. She meant it to be comforting, but it always sounded a little sad to me, like you couldn't count on the ones who were supposed to. Callum turned his mug in his hands. Maybe it's both, he said. She looked up at him. The ones who are supposed to, he said, and the ones who show up. There was the fire, and the snow outside, and Lily's small breathing from the corner. Why do you live up here alone? She asked. He thought about it. Always seemed like there was enough, he said. The mountain, the work. And now? He met her eyes across the table, and held them for a moment that was long enough to mean something. Seems like there might be more than enough, he said. March came in grey, and then one morning cracked open gold. The goat, whose name turned out to be Sutton, she had learned this from the rough notch. Callum had carved into the lean-to post, apparently years ago, for reasons he would not explain, turned out to be fresheninged, because Lily had developed a devoted interest in milk that exceeded what Josephine could reasonably supply. The morning after the first real warm day, Callum came inside to find Josephine attempting to explain to Lily, with limited success, that the goat was not a chair. He watched this for a moment. Then he went to the lean-to and came back with a tin pail. He sat down beside Sutton and started the milking with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had been doing it for years. Lily pulled herself upright against the fence rail and watched with the intense focus she reserved for things she found legitimately interesting, which included dogs, cooking fires, the carved wooden horse, and Callum. He filled the pail about halfway and looked over at Lily. You want to try? Lily didn't say words yet, but she made a sound that was clearly yes, and thrust both arms out, which was her method of indicating want. Josephine watched Callum guide her daughter's small hands and demonstrate, patiently, twice, and then let Lily do it wrong several times until she got it mostly right, and looked up with an expression of absolute triumph that Josephine had to press her lips together not to laugh at that night. Over the warm milk, Callum again heated on the stove. Lily fell asleep at the table between them like a small general after a hard campaign. Ranty, Josephine looked across at him. She's going to want to do that every morning now, she said. Callum looked at the sleeping baby. His face was open in the way it only ever got when he thought no one was watching him. "That's fine," he said, and then, quietly, "I don't mind the company." Josephine looked down at her hands. She had been alone for 6 weeks in the worst way a person can be alone, surrounded by people who had decided she was a problem to be solved, a number to be settled, a weight to be assumed by someone else. She had walked into that barn in January with nothing and the particular coldness in her chest of someone who has had to stop expecting good things, so the absence of them hurts less. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He looked down at it, then up at her. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Outside, the spring was coming. You could hear it in the water starting to move under the ice on the creek. You could see it in the way the light lingered, just a few minutes longer. Each evening, gold going to rose going to dark. Inside, Lily slept. And at the table, Callum turned his hand over and held hers, and neither of them let go.